Welcome everyone back from lunch. My name is CanAr. I'm here with the International Institute for Conflict Prevention and Resolution, otherwise known as CPR. So I want to get us started because we have a lot of ground to cover today and a great panel for you. For those of you who may be new to CPR, I want to take a minute to walk through a little bit about our organization. CPR was started in 1977 when a group of in-house counsel who were frustrated by the way that litigation was tying up their businesses in costly and lengthy disputes and disrupting the business organizations. They felt there had to be a better way, and so they created CPR. Today, CPR operates in two distinct divisions. We have the CPR Institute, which is our membership think tank side. We convene our members through committees and industry alliances. We mentor the next generation of leaders, and we publish on a monthly basis. On the CPR Dispute Resolution Services side, this is an ADR provider, has a panel of neutrals, and they use the rules that are promulgated by the CPR Institute to guide their administered and unadministered processes. So although I'm not on the dispute resolution services side, I will tell you just a minute about that because I know we have a lot of neutrals in the room. The CPR DRS has a distinguished neutral panel that is made up of over 600 mediators and arbitrators throughout the world. If you are not currently on one of our panels, please consider joining. And the CPR DRS uses the rules, as I said, from the Institute side to do both administered and non-administered rules for their process. You see we have domestic, international, and specialty area rules. Today's program is going to be talking about one of our newest sets of rules, which we are going to get into, but you see here it's called the Dispute Prevention and Management Board Rules. And we also have various protocols to help guide our neutrals through the process. Back on the Institute side, as I mentioned, we are made up of members who come from in-house counsel positions, top law firms, neutrals, academics, and together they join on various Institute committees. As you see, our corporate members here are just representative of a few companies that I'm sure many of you work with as clients or have done work with in the past. So those are some of our Institute members. And I'm just waiting for this slide to advance here. There we are. They come together on various practices related to arbitration, mediation, employment disputes, dispute prevention, and government and ADR task forces. And they also gather based on practice areas. You see here we have listed banking and financial services, construction, energy, oil and gas, healthcare and life sciences, and insurance. So there's a committee for every type of practitioner and every area of interest. So we hope that you will consider joining CPR's membership. And sorry folks, it's a little bit slow. We have members who come from all around the world. I have the pleasure of working with our international members. We have 3 international advisory boards in particular who guide us in areas including Canada, Brazil, and Europe. And I have here listed a few of the recent initiatives by each of those boards. I'm not going to take the time to go through that now because we really want to get to the good stuff, but just suffices to say that these international advisory boards are very active in their local regions. And I also have the pleasure of working with our Young Professionals group. We call the YADR Steering Committee. And I have here listed just some of the programs that they've done this year alone. So it's a very active group that is made up of young professionals under the age of 45 or with less than 8 years of experience. Why do I mention this? Well, some of you may be interested in joining, and right now is our once-a-year open application period. So it is a competitive application process, and we have incoming classes each year that serve on staggered 3-year terms. And so if you are interested or you know a young practitioner in your office or in your network, please encourage them to apply. It's a really dynamic group of leading professionals. As I said, we also publish. This is our Alternatives award-winning newsletter, which we publish every month. This is free to CPR members and available to all. And we also follow breaking news and dispute resolution through our CPR blog called CPR Speaks. And finally, although the weather is fine here in Toronto today, by February you might be ready for some warmer weather, so I invite you to join us. We will be having our annual meeting this year in Miami, so please meet us in Miami. So with that takes us to our program for today. As I said, we've just come out with a new set of rules at the Dispute Resolution Services side. So today's program is practicalities of utilizing dispute prevention and management board rules. And so I just want to know, I know everyone just had lunch, you might be feeling a little sleepy. I'm going to give you some incentive to pay attention to the panel. I have with me, I brought from New York City with me, a CPR bag with some goodies inside. So we will be asking a trivia question at the end of the panel. The first person to get the right answer will win this lovely bag. So just to keep you motivated. So without further ado, I want to introduce our stellar panel today. As I mentioned, we have a Canadian advisory board that guides our strategic initiatives here in Canada. Very pleased to announce that our moderator today, Martin Balasek, is a member of that Canadian advisory board. He's also a partner and co-head of the international arbitration practice at Bennett Jones. So those of you who had lovely coffee hour this morning, that was thanks to his office. And in addition to international arbitration, he also specializes in investment treaty disputes and commercial contract disputes. So we're very fortunate to have him leading our discussion today. I'm going to hand this off to Martin to introduce the rest of our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Canar. I was told to hold the microphone very close so that everyone can hear me, and I'm seeing people in the audience that I've done karaoke with, and I'm having a hard time preventing myself from just getting up and singing, but I won't do that. So, Canar mentioned a few times that the new rules are the rules for administered dispute prevention and management boards, and it was again, it's on our cover slide. But what's really important about these rules are that they are for commercial transactions. So that's something that is not on the title slide, but as our panels will explain, dispute avoidance or dispute prevention has been around in the construction and infrastructure space for probably some 25 years if you look at some of the specific evolution. So for example, FIDIC amended its Red Book, I think, in 1999 to mention dispute avoidance, and they're notably in, I think, 2017, they changed the name of their boards from dispute adjudication boards to dispute avoidance adjudication boards. So they went from DAB to DOB. Obviously in that space, as we'll hear, the participants in these complex projects believe it makes a lot of sense to get ahead of disputes before, or ahead of issues, I should say, before they crystallize into disputes. And we'll hear some anecdotes. And most importantly, we'll hear about this new set of rules whose innovation is to really think about this mechanism not only for construction and infrastructure projects, but more broadly for any complex commercial long-term transaction that could benefit from this type of process. I would like to get to the substance of the discussion, so I won't belabor any points. I would say that I do feel a little bit like the fox in the henhouse, because in reading about this area, one of the great benefits of dispute avoidance, and I think this was in the FIDIC paper that I looked at, one of the great benefits is, of course, avoiding the costs and time of resolving conflict, and in particular in arbitration. So in speaking to arbitrators and many counsel who are involved in arbitration practice, I do feel like I'm introducing a topic that some of us might prefer to think wouldn't help as much as it might. But the reality is that when you look at this from the perspective of clients and certainly in-house counsel, and all of our panelists have had extensive experience in-house, this is something that they would prefer to focus on. Obviously, no one's in the business of disputes. People are in the business of actually completing their project, getting things done. So without further ado, I will quickly introduce our panelists, starting with the panelist that is right next to me. If I can find my notes, Deborah. So Deborah Maston has a background in architecture and obtained her law degree from Northeastern, and for some 30 plus years, Deborah was in-house in serving as in-house for various counties in the Miami area, so Miami-Dade and then Broward County, representing the county in important public infrastructure and construction projects. For the last 10 years, Deb has focused largely on serving as neutral in the space and largely in the construction and infrastructure space. And Deborah is based in Miami. Michael Lampert is a graduate of Harvard Law School. His background is in political science before spending some 30 plus years as a associate and then a partner in various law firms, I think 3 or 4 law firms over the course of his career, largely serving in litigation, eventually serving as vice chair of the litigation department, and then spent 8 years in-house in a financial services firm, both in New York and in London, and also over the last 10 years has largely served as neutral. I should say that all of our panelists have incredible credentials, and I'm not going to go through all of them. It would take us the entire session. And finally, Elizabeth Preston has a law degree from McGill and has a background in history and political public policy from excellent schools, and she's been chief legal counsel and vice president of international compliance for General Dynamics Mission Systems International, and has a career spanning some 30 years as well, serving as executive, advising companies in all sorts of functions, including in complex international disputes. I should say that Mike and Deb share 2 important bonds. One of them is, if anyone's a hockey fan, you know that the Eastern Conference Final was between New York and Florida, so we have representatives of both of those jurisdictions. I don't know if it's going to come to blows, hopefully not. Anyway, it's been settled, that dispute has been resolved 4-2. And the other important bond is that they served as co-chairs of the task force for the team that put together the rules on conflict prevention and management. So without further ado, I'll ask Deb maybe to develop the notion that really these rules started in the construction and infrastructure space, and some of your experiences with how they've been used successfully and sometimes unsuccessfully.
Thank you. So, I mean, I'm not my first picture. So let me say, the dispute board looks like arbitration. There's 3 people typically on the panel. It is not arbitration. It is facilitative and conciliatory. It is not mediation. There are no ex parte processes involved. It is the only ADR structure that I'm aware of that looks forward. It doesn't look backward. The boards deal with anticipated issues that will impede or impair the progress of the work. And what CPR has done is taken this concept from construction and brought it to the commercial space generally. There are large, enormously large commercial transactions that have nothing to do with infrastructure. IT, health, life sciences, manufacturing, there are big relationships that extend from year to year where the parties need to get along and they need to be able to recast their original contractual provisions for whatever reason, because not everything is predictable. So let me show you my first dispute board. I was the employer's lawyer. I was in-house with Miami-Dade County. This is in Miami-Dade County, the Opera House. There's another matching building that's across the street from that. They both look very similar. And Florida Department of Transportation had been an early adopter of dispute boards. And so my client goes, let's put a dispute board on this really big, complex project. It was called the Jewel Box. There were no two elements that were the same dimensions. It was really complicated to put together. We said, okay, we'll put a dispute board in. We put the dispute board in, and we did it all wrong. The only thing we did right was to choose good panel members. We had 3 great panel members, but it took us so long to select them that the project was already on the 2nd floor by the time they were on panels. And by the time we finally started implementing it, we're like on the 4th floor. And we had a backlog of disputes, starting with, the project started late because the power company didn't move its transformer. And the contractor wanted additional compensation because of this, and we're having these disputes. And the board is saying to us, you're not using us right. And I'm like, I'm an experienced construction lawyer. I wrote these rules. I know what I'm doing. We were in essentially arbitral-like proceedings every month for months. And in the room, there were almost as many people as there are in this room. There was the contractor and the subcontractors and their insurance carriers and their counsel. And their excess carriers and their sub-consultants and their project managers. And we're looking around the room and saying, who's building my job? I mean, everybody's here that needs to be on the job. This is stupid. We got rid of it. And we supplemented with a standing neutral mediator, who again was looking backwards. He was solving problems that had already accumulated on the job. He did a great job, but it was backwards looking. So we said, this is a stupid idea, we're never doing this again. Until, slides are a little delayed. There we go. All right, so this is Miami International Airport, North Terminal, American Airlines. This was a project that had been built by American Airlines as a developer tenant. The county and American Airlines parted ways when they spent all our money and were only that far completed. And the county took over the completion of the work. The project went dark. We bid it again. And the successful bidder said, I'll give you a better price if you give me a dispute board. And we said to the client, don't do that. It's really stupid. It doesn't work. It's a theory. It's no good. And he goes, no, I like a better price. I think we're going to do this. So we put in the dispute board. We started meeting immediately upon the commencement of the new contractor who came in to finish the work. This is the worst kind of construction. It was unfinished. We didn't have as-built. We didn't know what was what. It was an operating airport. There were environmental hazards. The baggage system was in there somewhere. Passengers are still floating around in this retail lot. And it's an operating airport. So we had this dispute board. It was a $2 billion contract, not program, contract. This project finished with no disputes, no mediation, no arbitration, no litigation. There were change orders. They were consensual change orders that were agreed to by the parties in the regular interval meetings of the board that shepherded this project through and helped the parties deal with the challenges they faced as the work progressed and more unknowns became evident. And what's interesting about this one is the same contractor was working, this is North Terminal, the same contractor was working on South Terminal at the same time with no dispute board. Basically the same folks, the same staff, the same people. That project finished with an $85 million claim. And it was half the size of this one. So that's when I drank the Kool-Aid and became a believer. I got very active in the dispute board world. There are organizations of people who focus on promoting the use of dispute boards. University of Washington was one of the very early adopters. And you look at these statistics, and it's shocking. The dispute board is a facilitative project management tool. It supports the project team in reaching agreement while the project is underway. It's not stepped negotiation, which just to me is a time killer. You have the low-level people making a decision, but they don't have authority, and then you need the upper-level people, but they're out of town, and you got to wait 3 weeks, and then you get it up to the C-suite, and nobody's buying into what their underlings did over time. This is not that. This is people with authority while the project is underway, before the adverse thing that happened that was unexpected is going to impact the progress of the work. So the interesting thing, the University of Washington used this for all their campus construction, 2 formal hearings in 20 years. They never had to decide any disputes. The parties worked it out with their help. So it works.
Deb, I'd love to ask you more about the specific rules, whether ad hoc or otherwise, that were used, but I think we'll save that for later, because I would like to get into this notion of how we moved from these industries into the notion that maybe the rules or some form of similar rules might be applicable in other spaces. So Mike, maybe I'll turn to you to discuss how that came about.
Yeah, so this is all user-driven, right? So people in the pharmaceutical industry actually have some kind of model that's a little like this. If there's going to be a joint venture to produce a pharmaceutical, each of the joint venture participants will designate a person, and everybody agrees that those people's principal obligation is to the pharmaceutical, not to their employer. And the object is to make the pharmaceutical happen for everybody's benefit. And so those people that heard about the construction model and came to CPR and said, is there something we can do here? Should there be more formality? Should there be a whole additional set of procedures? People in large computer projects, which are multi-year bespoke computer systems. And again, it's kind of, they share in common with construction. It's really hard to interrupt once you start, right? You have players and they're all dealing with each other, and even if they don't get along well, they really do have to play nice to get to the end for the project to succeed. And there were other industries in which occasionally one sees in international joint ventures some sort of dispute neutral brought in initially and who works through. And so CPR sort of asked a larger question: can we generalize the construction experience and offer it to other industries? And so CPR put together a task force of approximately 30 people, and it had 4 principal responsibilities. One was to come up with a set of rules. Next was to figure out how to train people to do this, because skills are at least somewhat related to mediation and arbitration, but this, as Deb says, is not mediation and arbitration. And then how do you certify the people? And finally, how do you market this idea once it comes out? How do you get organizations? And remember, as Marty said at the very beginning, CPR is made up in a significant way of in-house lawyers who are looking for ways to improve dispute avoidance and resolution, or dispute prevention and resolution. And so Deb and I were co-chairs of the task force. A lot of credit to the 30 people in each of those tasks. Coming up with these rules was not simple. Deb and I think, attended all, but perhaps we missed one of the committee meetings, so we have a pretty good sense of the process by which this took place. But that doesn't mean we were the inventors of these ideas. It was really the members of the task force who came up with these ideas. And to give you one additional sense beyond the rules, so last Wednesday was the first real training of people. There are some people who had experience in the construction industry who've been certified as neutrals in this area. And Marty, go back to your fox in the hen house. So join us in the hen house and become a hen. Take the training.
Thank you, Mike. And so let's maybe get into the rules themselves a little bit. I think what we have on the next slide is the table of contents, and I should indicate, I really noticed this morning that there are some subsections that are missing because they don't have subheadings, but there is Rule 2.1 and 2.2. So 2.1, of course, deals with the purpose of the dispute management process and sets out a paragraph on the purpose. 2.2, for example, deals with the procedures that should be adopted. But I'd like to leave it to you two, who were very involved with the group and with the task force, to take us through what you think are the key features of the rules.
Let me just start by saying, when I did my boards, I had to write the rules. I was in-house, I did it, but you guys aren't all in-house, and it's a very time-consuming and challenging process. So we had some like prime objectives in our task force. The first prime objective was keep it simple. If it isn't simple, no one's going to use it. So we tried really hard to keep it simple. And as part of that, one thing you can just do if you choose to go down this path is just adopt the rules, similar to as you would adopt the arbitration rules of an administering body. You can adopt the CPR rules, and you've got a structure, a way to select your panel members, the process, and how one can move through dispute avoidance into dispute guidances, dispute resolution, and then ultimately a consent arbitration award or a disputed arbitration award if necessary.
And look, related to that is, in preparation for this panel, because we live in an AI growing world, I asked 4 different AI sources to summarize these rules. And it was interesting because 3 of them summarized the rules, and one of them, I don't know why it did it, actually did a little more looking on the web. And don't let the rules mislead you, because in some sense the rules are when things have gone awry, right? The notion is, how do you appoint this group of people? When do they meet? That all works, and that's all dealt with in the rules. But as Deb has indicated, a principal responsibility of those people is to understand what's going on in the project. To endeavor is the word, to move this out of construction and move from project to endeavor. And there are several places where we intentionally chose new or different language to indicate that construction is our parent, but we are bigger and different from that. If you go on to but the point is, these rules are designed to what happens if prevention doesn't work and there is a dispute, or at least 2 or 3 of these rules are. How do you write a rule that says, here's what you do to prevent a dispute in the first place? So the rules about how you choose and CPR is involved and things like that, those all work. But what the rule doesn't, that the table of contents doesn't reflect, is in fact the most important work of the board, which is, and Deb and I have different images for this, and at a couple of points I think of them as the board playing a role like a parent in at least 2 different ways. So one is, good parents can often tell when their children are about to go to war with each other, and they can prevent them going to war. They can intercede and either mediate before it gets to that point, or distract, or ask questions. And to some degree, good dispute board members will see issues that may exist in the project, in the endeavor, that perhaps the parties don't or don't want to admit exist. And the other important role that gets played by the board is, if you have siblings, sort of going to mommy or daddy is often the nuclear option. You really don't, you know that if you bring mommy or daddy in, you're as likely to be punished as your sibling. And so Deb can talk about this from her actual experience in construction boards, but she's had projects where, you want to pick up and talk about this in your projects? Where people have said to her, the board didn't do anything because the parties got together rather than present the issue to the board and said, can we work this out before we go to the board, right?
So I use the music teacher concept. All of you probably took music lessons as a child. When did you practice? Right? The night before the lesson. So the board does its main work with regular interval periodic meetings, monthly, quarterly, it depends on the complexity of the project at a particular point in time. So the board meets regularly at preset times. And what my clients started doing was getting together with the other project team members, the contractor, the designer, the major subcontractors, plan an agenda and work out, all right, they called it ball in court. Whose court is the ball in now? I'm taking care of this next step for this issue. You're taking care of the next step for this issue. They met the day before the board meeting and came, so they could come to the board meeting and say, we've got this under control. We don't need you. We handled it. It's done. This is a problem. This is how we're addressing it. Let's move on to the next one. It works in a very facilitative way that it's just the way we're hardwired to be cooperative if given an opportunity to cooperate. It is not adversarial, it's collaborative.
And we have rules that say lawyers should not be a part of the process, that they can advise clients, but if in fact people can't agree and you wind up getting involved in a more formal process where there's a request for a written recommendation, there's no cross-examination. It's much more actually the civil or inquisitorial model where the board says, okay, so what's the issue? And then asks questions about the facts relating to that issue. And it's not cross-examination, it's not live testimony, it's people reporting things in response to questions of the boards, and the rules quite clear about that.
And the rules provide that these are confidential meetings. Pre-rule, when I was writing my own contracts, I would say these are considered confidential mediation conferences. Never challenged, I don't know if it would stand up, but the concept is if people, like in mediation, if people are free to express brainstorming ideas, well, we could do it this way or that way, then a solution is more quickly able to be reached. If people can say things without any risk.
Deb and Mike, I think what I'll do is because the table of contents of the actual rules that all of you can access through the website are spread out over a number of slides, but we get to sort of a flow chart of how the rules work. So, you see here, scope of application, purpose and operations, there's a provision for the number and selection of board members, then a provision on various meetings. Then Rule 5 gets into disputed matters, and this is sort of the interesting point I think you raised, which is some of the AI summarizers kind of got focused on what eventually happens if you do get disputed matters, and then termination and substitution. This, yes,
Go
okay.
back to Mike's point. So
Yes.
Mike's point was, boards are meeting regularly. And I did have a client come to us and say, I want to stop these meetings. I don't want to pay for this anymore. We're having meetings just to have meetings. We don't have problems. We don't need this anymore. And his staff was all over him. No, we don't have problems because we're having meetings. And so we kept having meetings. And I will say that at some point, he refused to pay for the meetings. The contract provided that the owner would pay for the meetings. And he refused to authorize the payment. And the contractor gave us a notice of default. He said, my contract says I get these meetings. You're not funding these meetings. We can't have these meetings. There are now issues that are aggravated, and we need to have these meetings resumed. And it worked. Public humiliation is a wonderful thing.
But before we get to the flow, Elizabeth, I want to bring you into the conversation a little bit. Obviously, we've been focusing on the task force and what it did and so forth. I know in your various roles, including your current roles, in our discussions, you've said, some of these things I recognize, we may not have adopted these rules or have formal rules like this in our contracts, but I'm seeing some of this play out. Sometimes I don't, and I'd like to see it play out. What could you, just quick reflection on what you've heard so far, and from current in-house perspective, how it strikes you?
Right. So I work for one of the world's largest companies all around the world, and we primarily sell to governments. If we don't sell to a government, we're selling to another big, huge defense prime contractor that sells to a government. Usually our contracts are in the billions, multiple billions of dollars for something like a you know, an aircraft carrier or a tank or something like that. And I work for the people who put the guts in that, the electronics in that. And by the way, I went to University of Pennsylvania, which whips Harvard's butt in football all the time. Just saying.
He's a lot of undergrads.
I know, so it's just like they were going to fight it over later.
Dispute avoidance now.
Yeah.
Come on now.
So the interesting thing, Marty, is we do all of this and recognize all of this in these bureaucratic processes that we have with our government. So we call them IPRs, interim program reviews, or KPRs, which are key program or process reviews. We have all these different processes to do this. And, you know, if we're very unlucky, we might be terminated for convenience, and then there's also rules for that, you know. And so all of these things, all of these rules really resonate because that is what bigger companies do, naturally have to do, especially when you're dealing with the government, you have to have these, and it's not just escalating to more senior managers, it's you know, identifying issues before they fester, and especially in engineering companies, I have to say, like, I don't know anything about the construction industry, but for me, as in a huge engineering company, we use, well, for example, there's a process in engineering called Agile. That's where you don't really know what you're gonna make. You're gonna collaborate with your customer as you go. And oh my goodness, you can only imagine how long those contracts are and how change is defined and how do you figure out how much it costs when you kind of take a different route than you expected you were going to take. And so all of this just, I mean, it not only resonates, we use perhaps different words for it, and oftentimes we actually might write it up in a contract with, like, you know, bespoke words each time, but wouldn't it be great to actually refer to rules? You know, because those rules really do follow the processes that I think a lot of these companies take. And the last thing I would say is, I've also been in the same industry for 37 years, and I worked for little startups too, and boy, reinventing the wheel is hard, and having, you know, some kinds of, you know, tried and true kind of processes really save the money. And that is what, you know, in the defense and aerospace industry in which I work, that's really what we're looking for, because our margins are not huge. And we really do need to make sure that we're efficient when we have disputes or even see them brewing.
So coming back, I think we backtracked from that overview slide, which is very difficult to read. I'm not sure if it's legible on the big screen. But you know, that's a visual representation of, I guess, the key steps in the rules. But as we were discussing earlier, Mike and Deb, if this is working properly, most of what we want the board to be doing would prevent you going down the waterfall of recommendations and disputes. So you'd end up hopefully higher up in the flow chart. Is that fair?
100%.
Okay.
What the board does was elicit conversation, making people talk, and we'll boulderize a line from the movie Princess Bride, where they ask the tough questions, the bad questions, in the nicest possible way. So that people talk about things that they would rather avoid. Oh, I can handle it. If it happens, I'll take care of it. I don't need to, I already know, I can do this. The board forces people to talk about stuff that they don't want to talk about, so that they can collaborate on how to resolve the awful thing that might happen. You know, sinkhole opens up on your job, hurricane hits your project, flooding, COVID, things happen that just aren't in the contract, and the parties need to adjust and figure out what's the best way forward and the fairest allocation of resources. And the longer it takes to do that, the fewer choices you have, and the more expensive those choices tend to be. So the earlier that you can get in and start planning to regroup, the better it is for the project.
So can I make 2 quick points?
Of course.
Directly to the point of your original question. So if everything went perfectly, you'd never get past the third line of this. But we recognize that the world isn't always perfect. And so 4 and below are what happens in that hopefully rare but occasional instance. as Deb talked about, 2 and 20 years, you know. So the chart sort of disproportionately lays it out. And the other is, for those of you who are wondering, the chart is not an artifact of these slides here. The chart is an actual appendix to the rules, is available on the web with the rules. When the task force got done with the rules, we all said, gee, this is a little complicated. Would a flow chart actually help people understand? And members of the appropriate working committee came up with this flow chart, and it is published on the CPR dispute resolution side in the rules, with the rules.
Yeah, let me say, after my first experience at the airport, all my airport projects had dispute boards, all of them. The only board I was ever involved in that had dispute hearings was the Performing Arts Center. My worst, my only, after that, there were no dispute hearings. It was worked out in a very collegial, collaborative, professional way with the project team members.
I think we'll get, the thing that comes to mind immediately is what kind of people need to be involved in the roles, and we'll get to that in a second. Before we do, we discussed how difficult it is to reinvent the wheel each time. Obviously, the rules are there and they can be adopted, but what were your considerations in the model clause and so forth? The model clause exists on the website. Again, we can look at it, but what would you like to say about
So the task force had to confront the dilemma of, as Deb said, keep it simple, so somebody could write into the contract CPR rules and it would work. But, people say all the time, and I think it's true, and I think it's important, that ultimate dispute resolution is the product of the parties and can be tailored and bespoke for what the parties want. And so if you read the model clause has a couple of places. So for example, we call it a board in the same way in arbitration we typically talk about a tribunal, but as we all know, in an arbitration, a tribunal can be a single member. Often it's 3, but there's no rule against having a single person be the arbitral tribunal. We have some considerations both in the contract provision, and there are guidance notes in the rules about possible switches, about if you want to take the time, here are some things you might want to think about, and in the actual contract, you might want to vary our rules in a couple of ways. The most obvious is 3 versus 1, but there are others in periods of time. There are several rules, but the point, and I need to say this at some point, or Deb usually says this actually, if you do get into the more formal part of the process, if there's a hearing, the hearing produces an interim decision that people live with during the contract. And often disputes beyond the issuance of dispute are issues about one side trying to play games with money with the other side. And the hearing result, whatever the board says as to who pays whom or doesn't pay whom, for the life of the contract, that result binds. And if a party doesn't like that result, it must, within 15 days, say, we don't like that result. It must still obey it. But by saying that, it preserves its right, if it wants to, at the end of the project, to commence a more formal arbitration. But because you can't have the dispute members formally and finally adjudicate because they've learned a lot that you wouldn't want an impartial decider to know. So, but during the life of the contract, if you don't, there are 2 important clauses in these rules. You have to obey the rules, you have to obey the board's decision during the time, and failure to do so itself is a breach of contract. And if you want to go to adjudication, to court, or to arbitration, it's a condition preceding to doing that, as if it were a step clause, to have had a recommendation from the board.
And as I flipped through the rules, I saw, as you mentioned, in a number of areas there are some choices that can be made, and there are italicized paragraphs that are designated as guidance. So how did that come about, and what is a good example? For example, I'm looking at the frequency of meetings. For example, the default says that subject to agreement otherwise by the parties. In order for the board to become familiar with the endeavor circumstances, it will meet at least once per month. If conditions warrant, the chair, in consultation with other board members, may vary the time between meetings to better serve the parties, and the parties may invite the board to attend regular business meetings attended by executives or managers. And then the guidance note says factors to be considered when setting the time between meetings include work progress, occurrence of unusual events, and the number and complexity of ongoing or potential issues. And I guess, so that's an example of a guidance note. In your experience, how active are board members in actually varying themselves some of these parameters? And is that something that's within the scope of their power?
It's clearly within the scope of their power. Typically, they would vary it with certainly discussion with the parties, hopefully the consent of the parties. Sometimes projects, like Mike said, if a future pharmaceutical is undergoing testing, there's nothing going on at that moment in time. The time between the board meetings can be extended because there's no progress between the parties that needs to be addressed.
Or even strongly think about if you've applied for governmental approval for the pharmaceutical, you're waiting, right? In the studies example, you might actually, and this is another point in the rules, you can bring in people who are not parties to the underlying contract that are important. I'll let Deb talk about the Miami example in a minute, but in the pharmaceutical case, you might want to bring in the people who are actually doing the phase 1 and phase 2 trials to get them in the spirit of A, moving the project along, and B, seeing if there are any issues between the contracting parties and them. But Deb has a wonderful example for the Miami airport about non-contract parties.
So the rules provide that non-parties to the contract can attend the meeting subject to their agreement to the confidentiality of the proceeding. And so my example is, at one point, one of these very large jobs was running way behind schedule. It was late. And so there were two potential options for recapturing that time. One was to put on a third shift so that the construction work went on 24 hours a day, 3 shifts, which would require shutting down the terminal completely. There would be no other activity ongoing other than construction. The other option would be to put on just one other shift, so it's 2 shifts, 16 hours a day, but the terminal remained in operation to a limited degree. Cost the same either way. So the owner, the county, didn't care. The cost is the cost. The contractor didn't care. The cost is the cost. Its revenue would have been the same. The people who cared were the airlines, were the restaurants in the terminal, or the retail vendors, or the baggage handling system. There are all kinds of commercial operations that go on, and the airport's just a little, shopping center with a baggage handling system. There's all kinds of stuff that goes on in the terminal. Those people who are not party to these contracts cared. They were invited in to come to the discussions in front of the board about the options, the costs, and so they could inform the decision about which way to go, and they would understand the ultimate outcome, why the ultimate decision was made, and so there was no second level of disputes when they all complained. Everybody bought into the process, and it moved forward in an unexpectedly collegial and collaborative way.
Elizabeth, I wanted to get to you, but I see that
I definitely want to
you have
say
a comment.
something. So picture this, they have a huge contract, it's 30 years. It's with, let's say it's with the UAE government, the Saudi government, some government around the world have a different culture, let's say, than they do. And you're delivering something over a long period of time, and technology changes, right? Expectations change, maybe the exchange rate changes, like simple things and difficult things change. If you don't meet routinely, it will get away from you in many ways. And I think, for example, this only works if there's trust. This only works if there's an understanding of some speed of knowledge, building of knowledge, cultural differences. slowly but surely making sure you understand the cultural differences. Maybe even just in Canada, you know, there are differences in cultures between industries. There's a difference in culture between using a lawyer from one firm and a lawyer from another firm. You know, like if you don't, continually build that rapport and have a proactive approach to ward off things, because for us, most of the problems hide in the shadows, and they only come out because people have trust that they can, or some people don't even realize they're going to fester and become a problem because you have engineers or people at different levels. So if you have a board, a formal board or an informal board that meets no matter what, if only to create rapport, that is valuable, I think, especially in the prevention of disputes.
So I want to make sure we leave a few minutes at least for a Q&A. We're at 3:07. So just to finish on our final topic, we thought we would discuss some of the main drivers of success and failure of dispute avoidance. And the one that really sticks out to me is the qualifications of board members. And you mentioned training before, but could you comment on the types of qualifications that are appropriate for different projects?
So number one, you would, if you were to be considered to be a board member for one of these, you would need experience in that industry. You would need to know what's normal. You would need to know how the industry functions. You would need to understand the vocabulary, and you need to be able to bring something to the table. If the parties are at a loss of how to address something, it would be great if you could suggest options for them to consider. Number one. Number two, and what I think arbitration training and arbitration experience is very, very helpful in case you have to have one of these hearings at the end of the day. How do you manage a hearing? Mediation training and experience, or conciliation training and experience, facilitation training is critical. The skills to manage people skills, your interpersonal skills are paramount. Again, asking nasty questions in the nicest possible way. Does that crack up their bother anybody? I mean, things that will focus attention on what could possibly go wrong and the off-ramp to make it not go wrong. And so personal skills and
And look, so
the expectation of what the dispute board does. I mean, I have been appointed to dispute boards since I've left the county, and most of the time the project's complete. I'm like, this is not right. There's no point to doing this. You know, go to arbitration. We're not trying to do arbitration right here.
and if you have a three-person board, of course, the skills don't have to be identical. And in fact, the board is probably stronger if they have different skills, and whether those skills are different technical support or, and you talk about the guidance note, so there's a guidance note on this point. If you have a three-person board, it may be that the chair, the neutral, is a person who comes out of a legal background with appropriate dispute board training so that they can preside. In fact, amusingly, while this whole process has been going on, I've been approached about being on a construction board, and I've said, I don't really have background in construction, but the people who approached me have now said, would you be willing to be a chair if we had two construction people as your wings? And the answer to that question is yes. And these rules certainly contemplate the model of different skills, and particularly in a three-person board, the chair having dispute resolution / legal background.
Let me pause there. We have 5 minutes left. Are there any questions or comments from the audience? Janet?
I'm sure you've piqued the interest of many people in the audience. I wonder if you could just say a few words about the DRBF organization, Dispute Review Board Federation, and their work, because this is something that others may want to follow up on.
So there are actually two organizations. There's the Dispute Resolution Foundation, which is based in Europe, and the Dispute Resolution Board Foundation, not Federation, Foundation, which is based in the United States. And they are both born of the construction industry, and their entire purpose is to promote the use of dispute boards. They have rules, they have guidances, they have stuff on their website, they have trainings. And I would say that they are not focused on legal professionals. Their outreach is directed to industry professionals, so they spend a lot of time dealing with the dispute hearing in their rules and in their processes, because, I mean, I've worked with engineers, they don't know what hearsay is, guys. I mean, it's a different world, and you can't train a non-lawyer to go through a year of civil procedure and a 2-day training. I mean, so their focus is board related because that's the weak spot in their target audience.
I think we had a few hands up here. Yes.
I was just curious how CPR is going to get it out there so it is used in other contexts. I actually had a case with Stu Dreimer, I don't know if he's still here, not too long ago. And it was the beginning of the pandemic, and this was written into the contract. It's the first time I'd ever seen it. So they had set it up so that the normal selection process for the arbitrators, we would meet with the parties once a week for the first 2 months to get to know the business. We would help them resolve any issues that were coming up as it went along. And then it would turn into once a month or less frequently as necessary. And if they had a dispute, unlike this, we would be the arbitrator. So that was already written. We would be the decision makers, it would be binding. And I think the most useful thing we did for them during those early sessions was to tell them to get together and talk. I mean, these are adults, they need to be told, you should have weekly meetings. It never occurred to them until we said that. But I kept thinking, why don't we see this more often? Because it was such a useful mechanism for them, and it was great to do because you felt like, arbitration mediation really helping these people, move forward with a brand new product at the beginning of the pandemic, pandemic related, with all the issues we had that with supply and, employees and logistical issues. There were a lot of issues that had to be dealt with and had to keep it together.
So the answer to your sort of opening question is, until the project was ready for live prime time, there wasn't much to do. And the rules were published late last fall, and we're now going out and speaking about the rules in a variety of audiences. As I say, anyone who is already a CPR neutral, who expressed an interest in this field, if they had served on a board, they were immediately certified, and if they weren't, we offered training, and the first training session was last week. So we now have probably 35 people who can act, who CPR is ready to certify or understand this process. And there is a committee of the task force that is charged with outreach. How do we get interest? And there will be several different strategies. So one strategy is we already have interest. CPR's already had interest from a couple of industries. The people who expressed interest, CPR will go back to them and say, you asked, we answered. But there's also sort of a larger get out there, and we haven't talked about it at length, but for example, as former general counsel, Deb and I can write articles in the ACC docket, and I'm thinking that it may well make sense to get out to the Association of Corporate Counsel this evolution of the rules and explain in an article in the ACC docket. And there'll be other avenues that we can explore to educate people about this.
So I think we have time for one quick question and answer. Paul.
Yeah, I was just wondering, is there a direct correlation between the involvement of the board and the success of the board, or the success of the project? And my second question is, informal assistance, how much involvement might there be of the board in terms of informal assistance in the overall, proportion to the attendance per month?
The assistance is, like in mediation, asking questions, eliciting information. I see this, we're getting to a problem, this needs to be addressed. What have you thought of as options? Two parties, what have you thought of as potential ways to resolve this, or to fix this, or to minimize the cost of this? And then if they can, have you thought of tweaking it a little, bringing something to the table? They're not taking over the project, they are not technical advisors to the project. They elicit a fruitful conversation among the parties to consider options for addressing the issue that is nigh at hand.
And hopefully breaking through hidden agendas
Oh, yeah.
and trying to, break through the entrenchment of views, seeing the other side and so on. I think that's probably the most important thing for us, is that those entrenched views, especially when you're dealing with the government, maybe they have to do with budgets, maybe they have to do with their own governance issues or whatever
Authorities,
things we have.
maybe that the people that you're dealing with don't have the authority to say yes. They only have the authority to say no.
Yep, so figuring out what your brick walls are.
Right. And I think, just a closing point, the rules specify no ex parte communications, those are prohibited. And one of the things that I saw in a note that I read is a best practice is early on establish sort of a communication protocol, because clearly between meetings there could be and there should be communication by email or however, but that should be established.
Right, I mean, and I'm old enough to remember paper. But in this day and age, it costs nothing to add 3 names to an email. So that the board members can read the correspondence as it is happening in real time. They don't have to get a packet the night before. They're embedded in the project, as it were.
So I think we'll stop there. Kanar, do you want to? Oh, sure.
We'd love to talk about this stuff. We're around. Contact us.
Well, I want to thank our stellar panel today. That was such a great conversation, and thank you to Edna for asking about how we're getting the word out. We have been doing some programs like this. I want to mention we have someone in the audience, Roland Francis, who did a program for us in December for our global conference, which we talked about dispute prevention and specifically how to use these types of rules. We did a program just about 2 weeks ago in Atlanta. And now here in Canada, we've run the good news, so we will continue to spread information about this. So you're hearing it here first. So, and as I promised, we have this bag giveaway. So I'm going to ask just to raise your hand if you think you know the answer. Does anyone know the official title of this rule that we talked about today? What are the set of rules called? Does anyone remember? Oh, I didn't think that was going to be a tough one. I thought that was an easy one.
Short-term memories first.
So it's the dispute.
Give them a hint with the acronym.
DPMB. DPMB. Anyone has?
Dispute prevention management.
What? Hands up? Oh, it's Paul. Okay.
Dispute prevention management board.
Yes, that's right. Okay.